Before the fall, there was the ascent. Our story at its genesis is not one of impending ruin, but of dazzling, almost audacious success. Meet Arthur Hayes, a name that, in the rarefied circles of global finance and burgeoning tech, was synonymous with prescience and relentless innovation. Arthur wasn't just wealthy, he was a titan, a visionary whose touch seemed to transmute silicon into gold. His company, Chrysalis Global, had revolutionized micro-investing, turning modest sums into substantial portfolios for millions, all through an algorithm he'd coded himself in a cramped apartment just a decade prior. He was the golden boy, the darling of Davos, his face gracing the covers of Fortune and Forbes with almost monotonous regularity. He lived in a sprawling, minimalist mansion overlooking the Pacific, drove electric cars before they were a status symbol, and his charity galas were the stuff of legend. He had built it all, brick by meticulously placed brick, on a foundation of brilliant code, tireless work, and crucially, an unshakable belief in transparency. He preached it, he lived it, or so everyone believed. Arthur, for all his outward grandeur, remained at his core, a man driven by a singular, almost obsessive focus on the next big thing. His mind was a restless engine, constantly seeking inefficiencies to exploit, markets to disrupt. This drive, which had propelled him to such dizzying heights, also left a peculiar blind spot. He was so utterly consumed by the pursuit of perfection within his own creations that he often overlooked the imperfections and indeed the insidious machinations of those around him. He trusted implicitly, perhaps because he himself operated with such unvarnished honesty in his professional dealings. This was his fatal flaw, an Achilles heel masked by the gleaming armor of his success. He saw the world through the prism of his own ambition and integrity, rarely entertaining the notion that others might not share his code of conduct. Enter Marcus Thorne. Marcus was everything Arthur was not, yet paradoxically everything Arthur needed in a chief operating officer, or so it seemed. Where Arthur was a maverick, Thorne was polished, a corporate chameleon whose smooth demeanor and reassuring smile could charm even the most jaded investor. He had a pedigree from old money, an Ivy League education, and a network of contacts that stretched from Capitol Hill to the corridors of European power. Thorne had joined Chrysalis Global 5 years prior, initially as a strategic advisor, quickly ascending the ranks due to his uncanny ability to anticipate market shifts and deftly navigate the labyrinthine world of regulatory compliance. He spoke Arthur's language of disruption, but always with a subtle twist, subtly nudging Arthur's radical ideas into palatable, investor-friendly packages. Thorne was the public face, the handshaker, the man who could calm a panicked boardroom with a single, perfectly phrased sentence. What Arthur didn't see, couldn't conceive of, was the festering resentment beneath Thorne's perfectly tailored suits, the ambition that far outstripped mere corporate loyalty. Thorne viewed Arthur not as a partner, but as a stepping stone, a brilliant but naive tool to be eventually discarded. He envied Arthur's genius, but disdained his lack of guile, his transparent sincerity. The lie itself wasn't a sudden, cataclysmic event. It was a slow poison, administered with surgical precision. It began with whispers, subtle misdirections in quarterly reports, veiled suggestions to the board that Arthur's latest, most ambitious project, codenamed Project Chimera, a revolutionary decentralized finance platform, was encountering far more significant technical hurdles and financial overruns than was actually true. Thorne, with his intimate knowledge of Chrysalis's intricate financial architecture, began to siphon off funds, not in large detectable chunks, but in a myriad of smaller, untraceable transactions, disguised as development costs, shell company investments, and inflated vendor invoices related to Chimera. He created a phantom web of expenditures, fabricating a narrative that Chimera was a money pit, a flawed vision draining the company dry. He meticulously doctored internal audits, created dummy corporations for supply chains that didn't exist, and even went so far as to corrupt a handful of key mid-level employees who, through a combination of coercion and financial incentive, became complicit in his grand deception. The brilliance of Thorne's deception lay in its insidious synergy with Arthur's own focus. Arthur was deeply immersed in the complex algorithms of Chimera, pushing his team relentlessly, convinced that its perfection was just around the corner. He trusted Thorne implicitly with the mundane financial aspects, the operational grunt work. This implicit trust, this almost benevolent neglect of the financial minutiae, created the perfect vacuum for Thorne to operate in. He knew Arthur would only look at the big picture, the grand schematics of his technological marvel. He wouldn't pore over line-item expenditures or cross-reference vendor codes. This was a classic forest for the trees scenario, where Arthur's visionary gaze blinded him to the rot at the roots of his empire. Thorne's lie wasn't a direct accusation against Arthur. It was a slow, deliberate poisoning of the company's financial bloodstream. A subtle rewriting of reality until the false narrative of Chimera's failure became the perceived truth. It was a lie built on the very foundation of Arthur's passion and innovation, twisting his greatest creation into the instrument of his downfall. The first crack appeared not with a bang, but with a series of quiet, almost imperceptible shifts. A slight tremor in the stock price, an unexpected tightening of credit from a long-standing bank, a subtle chill in the air when Arthur spoke of Chimera to some board members. These were the faint echoes of the lie taking root, the first signs that the meticulously crafted illusion was beginning to solidify into a devastating reality. The tremors, initially dismissed as minor market fluctuations or the usual jitters associated with groundbreaking ventures like Project Chimera, rapidly escalated into a full-blown earthquake. Arthur, accustomed to navigating the volatile currents of the financial world with supreme confidence, found himself in uncharted, treacherous waters. The whispers that Thorne had so carefully cultivated among the board members and key investors began to solidify into concrete accusations. Reports of massive cost overruns for Chimera, once subtle suggestions, were now being presented as undeniable facts, buttressed by Thorne's fabricated ledgers and the quiet affirmations of his co-opted subordinates. The narrative was meticulously crafted. Arthur, brilliant but reckless, had allowed his visionary zeal to bankrupt the company, pouring billions into a project that was, in Thorne's expertly delivered assessment, nothing more than a fantastical pipe dream. The first public crack appeared in the form of a devastating article in the Wall Street Journal, not just reporting on Chrysalis Global's financial woes, but painting Arthur Hayes as an out-of-touch visionary whose ambition had blinded him to fiscal responsibility. The piece, undoubtedly fed by Thorne's anonymous tip-offs and carefully leaked doctored documents, detailed unfathomable expenditures on Project Chimera, juxtaposing Arthur's lavish lifestyle with the alleged squandering of investor capital. This was no mere journalistic inquiry, it was a character assassination, a prelude to the corporate coup already in motion. The stock price, once a soaring eagle, plummeted like a stone, wiping out billions in market capitalization in a matter of hours. Panic seized the market. Small investors, the very people Arthur had aimed to empower with Chrysalis Global, watched their life savings evaporate. The irony was a cruel twist of the knife. The man who had democratized finance was now being blamed for its most spectacular failure. The board meeting that followed was less a discussion and more a public execution. Thorne, with practiced gravitas, presented a damning dossier of evidence against Arthur. It was a masterpiece of misdirection, a tapestry woven from partial truths, expertly forged documents, and the carefully rehearsed testimonies of those he'd corrupted. He detailed embezzlement through shell companies that were, in reality, the very channels he'd used to siphon funds, expertly shifting the blame onto Arthur's supposed reckless financial management. The very complexity of Chimera's bleeding-edge technology, which Arthur had poured his life into, became a weapon against him. Thorne argued that Arthur had intentionally made the project's financials opaque, using its complexity to hide his malfeasance. The board, composed mostly of risk-averse individuals who preferred stability over innovation, were easily swayed by Thorne's calm, logical, and seemingly irrefutable presentation. They saw not the intricate beauty of Arthur's algorithms, but the damning red ink Thorne had so artfully spilled across the balance sheets. In a swift, brutal vote, Arthur Hayes was unanimously ousted from the company he had founded, from the empire he had built, from nothing. He was escorted out of his own building, a hushed spectacle for the very employees who had once idolized him. But the fall didn't stop there. The media frenzy intensified, transforming Arthur from a fallen hero into a villain. Regulatory bodies, spurred by Thorne's continuous anonymous tip-offs and the public outcry, launched investigations. Lawsuits from enraged shareholders piled up, each one a fresh assault on his dwindling reputation. His assets were frozen, his accounts seized. The minimalist mansion overlooking the Pacific, once a testament to his success, became a stark reminder of his ruin, eventually foreclosed upon. His personal relationships fractured under the immense pressure. Friends distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with the financial pariah. Even his long-term partner, initially steadfast, found the relentless public scrutiny and the sheer weight of his predicament too much to bear, eventually leaving him with a heartbroken apology, unable to reconcile the man she loved with the monster portrayed by the media. He was stripped bare, not just of his wealth, his company, his public image, but of his very identity. Arthur Hayes, the visionary, the titan, ceased to exist. In his place was a caricature, the man who lost everything to a lie. The crushing blow was not merely financial, it was existential. He became a ghost in his own life, haunted by the echoes of his past success and the deafening silence of his present isolation. The lie had not just taken his fortune, it had taken his future, leaving him adrift in a sea of public condemnation and personal despair. It was the complete obliteration of a life meticulously constructed, leaving behind only the rubble of a shattered dream and the bitter taste of betrayal. He had been a king. Now he was a pauper, not just in coin, but in spirit. It was the ultimate betrayal, not just of his trust, but of the very principles he had championed. The world had turned its back, convinced by a narrative so cunningly woven that truth itself seemed a distant, unattainable memory. The opulent mansion, once a monument to innovation and ambition, was a hollow echo, its emptiness mirroring the cavern within Arthur. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months, each marked by a suffocating sameness. The legal battles continued, a relentless assault by Thorne's legal team. Each new summons or court filing a fresh reminder of the insurmountable odds. His remaining assets, paltry compared to his former fortune, were steadily devoured by legal fees and the bare necessities of survival. He lived in a small, rented apartment on the outskirts of the city, a stark contrast to the panoramic views he once commanded. The hum of the city outside felt distant, alien. He was a ghost, haunting the periphery of a world that had moved on without him, a world he had once shaped. The solitude was a cruel, unrelenting companion. Friends, or rather acquaintances, who had basked in the reflected glow of his success, had vanished. The few genuine connections he possessed tried to reach out, but his shame, a suffocating blanket woven from public condemnation and personal failure, pushed them away. He rarely answered calls, ignored texts, and found excuses to avoid any face-to-face encounters. The media, having feasted on his downfall, eventually moved on to new scandals, but the articles, the scathing headlines, were etched into his memory, a permanent scar. He would often find himself staring blankly at the walls, the silence punctuated only by the distant wail of sirens or the drip of a leaky faucet, mundane sounds that in their ordinariness underscored the extraordinary ruin of his life. There was a particular kind of cold despair that settled in, heavier than any physical burden, a soul-deep exhaustion that made even the simplest tasks feel monumental. Getting out of bed was an act of rebellion against the inertia that threatened to consume him. He often walked aimlessly, avoiding main thoroughfares, seeking refuge in forgotten parks or along the neglected stretches of the riverfront. It was on one such dreary afternoon, rain-slicked and grey, that the first subtle shift occurred. He found himself sheltered beneath a decaying bridge, watching the river, swollen with the recent downpours, rush past. Litter, detritus of the city, swirled in the eddies. Among the debris, caught on a snagged branch, was a tattered, waterlogged children's book. Its cover, despite the grime, depicted a crudely drawn phoenix, wings outstretched, rising from flames. It was a cheap, mass-produced image, yet in that moment, under that desolate bridge, it felt like a direct, almost mystical message. He remembered a passage from an obscure philosophical text he'd once devoured in his youth, a line that had always fascinated him with its stark simplicity. Only when we are truly lost do we begin to find our way. He had dismissed it then as poetic idealism, but now the words resonated with a chilling, undeniable truth. He was lost, utterly, irrevocably lost. And in that raw, exposed state of profound loss, a flicker of something new, something defiant began to stir. It wasn't a sudden burst of inspiration, not a heroic epiphany bathed in cinematic light. It was quieter, more insidious. It was the slow burn of indignation. Thorn had not just ruined him, he had stolen his truth. He had taken Arthur's very life's work, Chimera, and twisted it into the weapon of his destruction. The idea of Project Chimera, revolutionary and transformative, still burned within Arthur, a perfect, uncorrupted vision. He knew with absolute certainty that Thorn's accusations were a lie. He also knew that he, Arthur Hayes, had the knowledge and the sheer intellectual capacity to prove it. The thought, initially a faint whisper, grew louder, fueled by a simmering rage that was surprisingly invigorating after months of listless despair. The true turning point wasn't the phoenix, nor the philosophical quote alone, but the dawning, furious realization that he had allowed himself to be defined by Thorn's lie. He had allowed himself to become the caricature. He, Arthur Hayes, had built an empire, not on deceit but on ingenuity. He possessed a mind that had unlocked patterns others couldn't even perceive. This was not the end. This was merely the deepest point of the plunge, the moment where the pressure was greatest, and where, if one did not entirely shatter, one could forge an unbreakable resolve. He remembered a phrase often attributed to mountaineers, about how the most challenging climbs begin not with a soaring ascent, but with a deliberate, painstaking effort to find purchase in the rock, one small handhold at a time. He had hit rock bottom, yes, but crucially, he had found the bottom. And from that solid, unyielding surface, a new kind of ascent, far more arduous but infinitely more meaningful, could begin. The despair was still there, a heavy shadow, but now it was tinged with a nascent, fierce determination. He wouldn't just recover, he would prove them all wrong. He would reclaim his truth. The decision to fight back was not a grand pronouncement. It was a quiet, internal vow forged in the crucible of his despair. Arthur Hayes knew he couldn't simply retrace his steps. The financial world, once his domain, was now a minefield of suspicion and lingering animosity. His name was mud, his reputation irrevocably stained. To attempt to launch another Chrysalis Global, to seek venture capital or public trust through conventional means, would be an exercise in futility. He had to operate beneath the radar, away from the glaring scrutiny that had once defined his every move. This meant shedding the very trappings of the empire he once commanded. No lavish offices, no grand PR campaigns, no army of well-paid analysts. His resources were meager, his connections burned bridges. He was, for the first time in his adult life, truly on his own. His initial steps were almost comically humble for a man who had once commanded billions. He moved out of the rented apartment, unable to afford even that, and found a tiny, run-down studio above a struggling laundromat in a forgotten district. The perpetual hum of washing machines became the soundtrack to his new life. His office was a battered wooden desk he found discarded on the street, his equipment a second-hand laptop and a cheap, prepaid phone. He spent weeks, then months, poring over public financial records, legal filings related to his case, and the increasingly complex digital footprints Thorne was inadvertently leaving behind. He was looking for patterns, for anomalies, for the faint scent of the truth buried beneath layers of fabricated data. His genius, once applied to creating wealth, was now laser-focused on deconstructing a lie. It was painstaking, thankless work, often stretching late into the night, fueled by instant coffee and a fierce, almost vengeful determination. He understood that to expose Thorne, he couldn't rely on the same systems Thorne had so expertly corrupted. The traditional financial audits, the established regulatory channels, all had failed him. He needed a new kind of audit, a decentralized, transparent system that couldn't be manipulated. This was where the true genius of Project Chimera, the very vision Thorne had exploited, found its new purpose. Arthur began to prototype a new iteration of Chimera's core principles, not as a speculative investment vehicle, but as an immutable ledger, a blockchain-based system designed to track financial transactions with absolute, unalterable transparency. He worked in isolation, a digital recluse, the code blossoming on his screen, line by meticulous line. This wasn't about making money. It was about creating an undeniable self-verifying truth. The crucial turning point in this phase was his serendipitous encounter with Ilara Vance. Ilara was a brilliant, eccentric data scientist and a fierce advocate for digital privacy, operating a small, independent online forum dedicated to exposing corporate malfeasance. She had been one of the few, the very few, who had publicly questioned the swift condemnation of Arthur Hayes, sensing a deeper narrative in the collapse of Chrysalis Global. Her forum was a repository of leaked documents, whistleblower testimonies, and the collective digital sleuthing of a global community. Arthur, through a series of anonymous, encrypted messages, reached out to her, sharing fragmented pieces of his own investigation. Ilara, initially skeptical of the infamous Arthur Hayes, was gradually won over by the undeniable logic of his digital forensics and the raw honesty of his desperation. She became his first and most crucial ally. She provided the platform, the network, and the critical mass of highly skilled, anonymous individuals willing to contribute their expertise. Cybersecurity experts, forensic accountants, data miners, all disillusioned with the system, all drawn to the tantalizing possibility of exposing a truly grand deception. Together, Arthur and Ilara spearheaded what they internally called Project Echo. It was an audacious, entirely unconventional counter-investigation. They used open-source intelligence, deep web mining, and crowdsourced analytical power, all funneled through the secure, unhackable framework of Arthur's evolving Chimera prototype. They didn't have the resources to hire private investigators or compel testimony. Instead, they built a digital army of truth seekers. They followed the digital breadcrumbs of Thorne's shell companies, traced the flow of laundered funds through obscure offshore accounts, and meticulously cross-referenced his fabricated vendor invoices with legitimate public records. Every piece of information, no matter how small, was uploaded to their secure, decentralized ledger, becoming an unchangeable, verifiable fact. It was a slow, grinding process, like chipping away at a granite mountain with a jeweler's hammer, but each chip revealed more of the truth, This wasn't a comeback built on financial might or PR spin. It was a comeback built on pure, unadulterated truth, meticulously pieced together by a disgraced genius and a network of anonymous digital warriors, all operating from the shadows. The very thing Thorne thought he had destroyed, Arthur's technological prowess and his belief in transparency, was now being weaponized against him. An echo of the legendary phoenix, rising not from grand flames, but from the quiet, persistent glow of a monitor in a forgotten room. The final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place during a relentless, storm-battered week. Project Echo, Arthur's clandestine network, had finally unearthed the definitive proof. A series of encrypted communications between Thorne and a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands, detailing the precise mechanisms of the financial siphon. Thorne's elaborate web of false vendors and inflated contracts was meticulously unraveled, each transaction logged and verified on Arthur's nascent, immutable ledger. The evidence was irrefutable, a digital fortress of truth that even Thorne's influence couldn't dismantle. But the question remained, how to unleash it? A quiet handoff to regulators might ensure justice, but it wouldn't be the public, undeniable vindication Arthur craved. He needed to expose the lie with the same devastating clarity with which Thorne had spun it. The opportunity arose through a highly anticipated, live-streamed global economic forum in Geneva. Marcus Thorne, now the celebrated CEO of the rebranded Chrysalis Global, was slated to deliver the keynote address, waxing lyrical about ethical innovation and restoring market trust. The irony was a bitter gall in Arthur's mouth. This was Thorne's victory lap, a public coronation built on Arthur's ruin. It was the perfect stage, the grandest possible audience for a reckoning. Ilara, with her network of digital activists, orchestrated the infiltration. Not a physical breach, but a sophisticated cyber maneuver designed to piggyback on the forum's global broadcast. Arthur, dressed in a simple, unadorned suit that belied the fury and determination beneath, arrived at the sprawling convention center as an uninvited guest. He was a ghost from Thorne's past, a specter of the truth. Thorne, radiating an almost arrogant confidence, was mid-sentence on the brightly lit stage when the first glitch occurred. His impeccably designed presentation screen flickered, then abruptly cut to a black background with a single stark white word: truth. A ripple of confusion spread through the audience of global elites, journalists, and financial titans. Thorne's practiced smile faltered. Then, Arthur's voice, calm and steady, devoid of the anger that simmered within him, filled the vast hall, amplified through the forum's own sound system. It was not a grand, theatrical accusation, but a methodical, almost clinical dismantling of Thorne's carefully constructed empire of lies. "Ladies and gentlemen," Arthur began, his image now appearing beside the word truth on the screen, a stark, unedited contrast to Thorne's polished facade. "My name is Arthur Hayes. You know me perhaps as the man who supposedly squandered billions on Project Chimera. Tonight, I offer you the true story of how those billions were spent." What followed was a masterclass in digital forensics and narrative control. As Arthur spoke, the screen behind him transformed. It wasn't just data, it was a visual representation of Thorne's embezzlement. Animated flowcharts meticulously traced money from Chrysalis Global accounts through a labyrinth of shell companies, highlighting the inflated invoices and the fraudulent vendor payments. He showed side-by-side comparisons of Thorne's falsified reports and the undeniable reality of the blockchain-verified transactions. Each graph, each data point, each line of code Thorne had corrupted was laid bare for the world to see. Arthur didn't shout or accuse. He simply presented the facts, allowing the undeniable weight of the evidence to speak for itself. He focused on the integrity of the Chimera project, explaining how its decentralized, unalterable nature had, ironically, become the very tool of his vindication. He revealed how Thorne had deliberately sabotaged the project from within, not because it was flawed, but because its transparency threatened his illicit activities. Thorne, initially frozen in disbelief, then rage, tried to interrupt, his voice a guttural roar against the calm precision of Arthur's exposition. "This is a hack, a malicious attack," he bellowed, but his words were drowned out by the murmur of the crowd, the frantic clicking of cameras, and the growing hum of murmuring outrage. Security moved in, but they were too late. The truth, meticulously curated and amplified by Ilara's global network, was out. The digital evidence, now live and accessible through a series of anonymous links flashed on the screen, was already spreading like wildfire across the internet. The confrontation wasn't a physical fight, but a battle of narratives, and Arthur, the master of algorithms and truth, had won. Thorne's face, once smooth and confident, contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury and despair as he watched his carefully constructed world crumble around him in real time. His empire, built on lies, was exposed by the very technology he had sought to destroy. For Arthur, it was a complex cocktail of emotions. There was the surge of righteous vindication, the profound relief of finally shedding the burden of false accusation. But there was also a hollow ache. Justice was being served, yes, but the years he had lost, the relationships shattered, the trust irrevocably broken, those could never be fully restored. This wasn't merely about seeing Thorne arrested, though that would surely follow. It was about reclaiming his name, his work, and his inherent belief in truth and transparency. It was both justice for the wrongs committed and, in the eyes of a world now watching with stunned realization, a profound act of self-redemption. The legend wasn't just in the comeback, it was in the defiant, ingenious way he forced the truth to the surface, shining a light into the darkest corners of deception. The immediate aftermath of the Geneva revelation was a whirlwind of public apology and private reckoning. Marcus Thorne was swiftly arrested, his vast network of deception unraveling under the relentless scrutiny of global regulators, finally armed with irrefutable evidence. The media, having once condemned Arthur, now clamored for his story, eager to celebrate the phoenix who had truly risen from the ashes. Offers for book deals, speaking engagements, and consulting roles flooded in. The financial world, initially skeptical, watched with a mixture of awe and trepidation as the Project Echo ledger, built on Arthur's refined Chimera technology, became a global standard for transparent, verifiable financial tracking. But for Arthur, this wasn't about reclaiming his old throne. The experience had irrevocably changed him. He had stared into the abyss of absolute loss, had seen the fragility of traditional systems, and had found his way back through an unconventional path fueled by truth and decentralized collaboration. His comeback was never merely about restoring his personal fortune or even his reputation. It was about something far more profound, redefining the very concept of trust in a digital age. He had built an irrefutable proof of concept for a world where lies, especially financial ones, could no longer hide. Arthur didn't rebuild Chrysalis Global. Instead, he founded the Veritas Foundation, a non-profit entity dedicated to promoting radical transparency and fostering decentralized, immutable data systems. His focus shifted from accumulating wealth to empowering truth. The core technology of Project Echo, born from his crucible of betrayal, was open-sourced, made freely available to governments, corporations, and even individual citizens. He became a tireless advocate for digital ethics, testifying before congressional committees, lecturing at universities, and collaborating with international bodies to implement these new standards. His voice, once silenced, now resonated with the authority of someone who had lived the consequences of unchecked deception and emerged victorious. His legendary status wasn't forged in the millions he recouped, though he did eventually recover a significant portion of his assets, which he largely channeled into the foundation. It was forged in the impact of his innovation on the global landscape. Project Echo, under the Veritas Foundation's guidance, became instrumental in uncovering several other large-scale corporate frauds, tracking illicit financial flows, and even verifying humanitarian aid distribution in crisis zones. He wasn't just a tech mogul anymore. He was a guardian of digital integrity, a champion of truth in an increasingly complex and often opaque world. He had turned his personal tragedy into a universal solution. The narrative of the man who lost everything to a lie evolved into the man who used that lie to change the world. He proved that true wealth wasn't just in monetary accumulation, but in the enduring value of integrity and the power of an idea that could democratize accountability. He fostered a new generation of digital detectives inspired by his story, individuals who believed that technology could be a force for profound societal good. His own life became a testament to resilience, to the idea that even from the deepest despair, one could not only rebuild, but build something exponentially greater than what was lost. The legendary aspect wasn't a sudden, heroic act, but the slow, consistent, and ultimately transformative ripple effect of a single man's refusal to let a lie define him. Arthur Hayes didn't just get his life back. He gave the world a vital tool for its own protection, ensuring that the dark path forged by Thorne's deception might ironically illuminate the way forward to a more transparent future. His comeback wasn't a return to glory. It was the birth of a lasting legacy, ready to dive deeper into stories of triumph against all odds. If Arthur Hayes' legendary comeback resonated with you, imagine the untold sagas waiting to be discovered. Subscribe, like, and hit the notification bell to join our community of truth seekers. Don't miss out on our next deep dive into the extraordinary lives that redefine what's possible. Your journey for inspiring narratives starts here.